We've all been there, right? It's election night. The tension is high, you can't stop refreshing the news, and for weeks, you've been swimming in a sea of polls telling you who's up and who's down. But how much should we actually trust those numbers? Well, it turns out the answer lies in knowing the difference between a crystal ball and a really good measuring tape.
So that's the big question, isn't it? I mean, how can a survey of maybe 1,000 people possibly tell us what millions are going to do? It kind of feels like magic, or maybe even impossible. But it all comes down to this really powerful scientific idea that a small, carefully chosen sample can tell you a whole lot about the entire population.
But, and this is a big but, that science is never perfect. Just look at this data. This is from what experts call the gold standard of political surveys. Back in '64, you can see the error was over 6 points. And even as recently as 2020, it was still off by almost 4 points. So the big takeaway here isn't that polls are useless. It's that the secret to forecasting isn't about getting rid of the error. It's about understanding it.
All right, so to really unpack all this, here's our game plan. First, we're going to tackle the prediction puzzle itself. Then, we'll put that gold standard survey under the microscope. After that, we'll get into a super important idea called the margin of victory. See how that tells us how many people to poll. And finally, we'll wrap it all up to understand the true purpose of a forecast.
So let's dive right into part one, the prediction puzzle. You know, we tend to look at election polls like they're a crystal ball, giving us a sneak peek into the future. But the people who actually make the polls, they see them very, very differently. And here it is, the core problem in a nutshell. The experts, the pollsters, they're always saying, hey, this is just a snapshot in time. But every single one of us, the media, you, me, we immediately take that number and treat it like a prediction for what's going to happen on election day. Understanding that gap between a snapshot and a forecast is everything. Okay, so let's actually put that snapshot idea to the test. We're going to look at something called the American National Election Studies, or ANES for short. For decades, it's been the top-tier academic survey for figuring out why we vote the way we do. So, if it's just a snapshot, how well does it actually predict the final score?
And when we say gold standard, we are not kidding. The ANES has been the bedrock of serious research on voting for over 70 years. This is not some quick phone call poll. We're talking detailed, in-depth interviews. If any survey out there is going to be accurate, you'd bet on this one. Now check this out. What you're seeing here really shows the power of the ANS. On the bottom, you have what voters told the survey they were going to do. And on the side, you have the actual final election result. Just look at how tightly all those dots hug that line. It's incredible. It tells us that for 70 years, what people said they'd do was remarkably close to what they actually did.
So just how close is it really? Well, the researchers crunched all the numbers from every one of those elections, and the answer is a mean absolute error, which is just a fancy way of saying the average miss of 3.68 percentage points. So even this gold standard poll is, on average, off by just under 4 points. But let's put that number into perspective. An error that small means the ANES correctly called the winner of the national popular vote 15 out of the 18 times it ran. That is an 83% success rate. That is pretty darn good for a tool that claims it's not a forecast. But what about voter turnout? This is a huge headache for pollsters, and the ANS isn't immune. See the two lines on this chart? The dashed line is how many people said they'd vote. The solid line is how many actually did. People always say they're going to vote more than they do. We all want to sound like good citizens, I guess.
Okay, so this seems like a deal breaker, right? If you can't even get the turnout right, how can your prediction be any good? But here's the crazy part. The researchers tested this, and the answer was a surprise. Turns out, this overestimation doesn't really mess with who people say they're voting for. It seems like the non-voters from both sides fib in about equal numbers, so it all kind of cancels out in the end.
All right, so we've seen the history, the practitioner's view, it shows us what happens. Now let's switch gears and look at the theorist's view to understand why it happens. We're going to get into the math that explains why some elections are blowouts and others are absolute nail-biters. And it all comes down to one single, powerful concept. And that concept is the margin of victory, or MOV. It sounds complicated, but it's simple. It's just the smallest number of votes you'd have to switch from one candidate to another to flip the winner. It's the purest way to measure just how close a race really is.
Probably the best way to get your head around this is with an analogy. Imagine you're tasting a giant pot of soup to see if it's salty. If the chef dumped the whole salt shaker in there, one tiny little spoonful is all you need. You'll know right away. But if it's just, borderline, you might need a few different spoonfuls from different parts of the pot to be sure. That saltiness? That's the margin of victory.
Which brings us to the most practical question in all of polling. How many people do you actually need to talk to? How many spoonfuls of soup do you need? Well, the math of sampling gives us a surprisingly clear answer, and it all links right back to that margin of victory.
It works exactly like our soup pot. If it's a landslide election, the margin of victory is huge. The soup is incredibly salty. The winner is obvious, so you need fewer samples, a smaller poll, to be confident. But in a super close election, the margin of victory is tiny. The soup is just barely seasoned. It's uncertain, so you need way more samples to be sure you're not just getting fooled by random chance.
And this right here, this is the most profound, kind of mind-blowing takeaway from all of this. The number of people you need to poll has almost nothing to do with whether you're polling a town of 10,000 or a country of 300 million. It has everything to do with how close you think the race is going to be. That's why a national poll can have the same sample size as a poll for just one state.
So, let's bring it all together now. We've got the practitioner's view, all that historical data from the ANES. And we've got the theorist's view, the mathematical world of the margin of victory. So how do they fit together?
They're really just two sides of the same coin. The ANS study showed us that the average error was around 3.7%, while the margin of victory theory explains why. That 3.7% isn't some random number. It's the average result of all the different soup saltiness levels from every election since the 50s. Remember that big 6-point miss in 1964? Total landslide, a very salty soup. The 4-point miss in 2020? A much, much closer race. The big polling misses almost always happen in the tightest contests.
And this gets us to the most important point of all. We really need to stop thinking of polls as crystal balls that tell the future. A good scientific forecast isn't about giving you one magic number. Its real job is to be a measuring tape. Its job is to tell us the range of likely outcomes, and most importantly, to tell us exactly how much uncertainty we're dealing with. It's about measuring that uncertainty, not pretending it doesn't exist.
So that leaves us with one last really important question to think about. We live in an age where elections seem to be getting closer and closer, decided by razor-thin margins. If that trend continues, and the margin of victory in our elections keeps shrinking, what does that mean for the future of forecasting? Well, it means the job of telling a salty soup from a bland one is only going to get that much harder.